Professor Emeritus of Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town and the former director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies. He has written and edited a dozen books, including The Roots of Anti-Semitism in South Africa, and with Christopher Browning, Michael Maris and Susanna Heschel, Holocaust Scholarship, Personal Trajectories, and Professional Interpretations. Most recently, he wrote Perfect Storm, Antisemitism in South Africa, 1930-1948, and in 2014 he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa. Welcome.
The book I'm talking on, A Perfect Storm, The Roots of the Anti-Semitism in South Africa from 1930 to 1948, is part of a trilogy on the history of anti-Semitism in South Africa. As Aaron said, The Roots of Anti-Semitism was published over 20 years ago, which looked at the period up to 1930, and this one looks at the high point of South African anti-Semitism during the 30s and into the 40s. That was the real high point, and we'll reflect on the changes of the nature of anti-Semitism even beyond 48 as well. Now I should note we're dealing in this case essentially with white attitudes towards Jews. All the evidence points to the black majority not separating the white population in terms of ethnic groups. Later on, of course, images do build up, and in my third volume I'll certainly be exploring black attitudes towards Jews. But in this case, it's very much a story of whites. For the African majority, it was a case of separating Afrikaans speakers perhaps from English speakers, but it was effectively white oppression over blacks, and there was no need to bring Jews in any direct way. In saying that A Perfect Storm was the high point of anti-Semitism, the period can be bookended by the massive poor white, mainly Afrikaans problem, in which a study in 1932 under the Carnegie Commission identified 1 in 5 Afrikaners living below the poverty datum line. And that's your really foundation for what was going to go on the one side. And on the other side was the rise of a particular form of folkish Afrikaner nationalism, which was rooted in European ideas, conflating state, people, and so forth. And yet none of this could have taken off without the long maturation of an anti-Jewish stereotype going back to the late 19th century. What we have in the 30s is the transformation of what Todd Endelman has referred to as private anti-Semitism into public or programmatic anti-Semitism. In other words, prior to 1930, anti-Semitism revolved very much around ideas. Programmatic anti-Semitism is the call for limiting the power of Jews, limiting their role in the professions, and so forth. And that was a major feature of the 30s and 40s, coming from the right, Afrikaners in particular, Hendrik Verwoerd, who I'll talk about, the architect of Apartheid, but shared at some level by the English speakers, as we'll see. Just to say a few words about the construction of the Jew from the late 19th century, because they played on these ideas in the 30s and they resonated precisely because an anti-Jewish stereotype had been so deeply embedded by 1930. If you go back to the discovery of diamonds and gold, the mineral revolution from the 1860s, 1880s, already the Jew gets embroiled in the stereotype of illicit diamond buying and working on the mines and then dominating the mines, the landlords and so forth. On the other hand, you have the urban Jew. In South Africa, a particular term emerges, the Peruvian Jew, the urban huckster, part of the underworld of Johannesburg, of Cape Town. And that's another dimension of the stereotype. And they all come together with the smos, who's the urban trader, who's seen to be, in Afrikaans, verneerking, exploiting the Afrikaners in the rural areas. And this is a dominant stereotype as well. And yet there's a transformation of the Jew where, moving from the backpack selling to the farm's goods, he becomes the landlord on the Witwatersrand, dominating the mining industry. And here we have the cosmopolitan financier. And it's the Jew who gets seen to be behind the Anglo-Boer War in 1899 by some left circles, particularly in England. The pro-Boer left saw the Jew and the Jewish imprint on that war. And it's after the war that one gets the famous or infamous caricature, Hoggenheimer, a cartoon caricature who exemplifies cosmopolitan capitalism and the reach, and an ugly caricature who becomes increasingly ugly as we move into the 20th century, usually associated with the cartoonist D.C. Boonzaier, and often mistakenly linked to Ernest Oppenheimer, the huge financial family entrepreneurs in South Africa, but it has nothing to do with Oppenheimer. It's a stage character in a play written in England, The Girl from Kays, which is written in 1902 and comes to South Africa in 1903. And Boonzaier, the cartoonist, actually goes to the theatre. He's an avid theatre goer, and he sees the play. And up to then, he had already had cartoons of the financial entrepreneur in the mines. But interestingly, he then gives a name after that play, and he says, "I'm Mr. Hoggenheimer," with apologies to The Girl from Kays, which is the name of the play. And it sticks. It resonates across the country in a remarkable way. Right now in South Africa, those who follow the news have heard of one Mr. Gupta, an Indian person who is replacing Hoggenheimer, who's probably long dead in South Africa. Since the 1980s, one hardly hears of Hoggenheimer as a symbol of Jewish power or financial power. But one Mr. Gupta is the person to look out for from now on. Anyway, the stereotype is well evolved by the time the First World War begins, and then it gets embellished during the First World War, with Jews shirking from military service, or at least allegedly shirking from military service. And then it takes on a distinctive turn after the Russian Revolution, where the Jews are associated with Bolshevism. So the left becomes important, and this, of course, will emerge in the 30s as well, as particularly Jewish left. And it's in the 1920s that things are particularly interesting. It's at that point that the language changes from the undesirable East European Jew, the great influx of Jews to South Africa were East Europeans, to the unassimilable Jew, Jews who were a people apart. And this becomes very, very powerful through the 20s and gets embroiled with great fears, even by liberals, of miscegenation, black urbanization, and the Jew becomes an outsider. And this leads up to the Quota Act of 1930, which was a direct stopping of the East European migration. The lifeline of South African Jewry ends in 1930. This is important because it precedes what goes on in Europe. And those people looking at the 30s as having no connections to the earlier developments miss the point when they look at the rise of fascism in Europe. They look at the rise of Hitler from 1933 and the studying of Afrikaners in Europe and Germany in particular, and assume that anti-Semitism was an import from Europe alone. It resonated because of that stereotype I've built up to 1930, and the evidence was that in 1930, when the Quota Act is introduced, by the way, modeled on the Johnson-Reed Act in the United States, but that Act of 1930 was supported across language lines. And the man who introduced it as the Minister of the Interior in the government, the coalition of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party and the Labour Party, is Dr. D.F. Milton, the first apartheid Prime Minister. And he's the man who actually leads the bill, which goes down unanimously in the House. English speakers, Afrikaners, are quite happy to stop the unassimilable Jew coming in. The English are quite happy to have less competition from merchants. And the Afrikaners, as I said, are largely poor whites, unskilled, ill-equipped as they move towards the cities with migration, and are confronting the Jew who seems to be the symbol of the city and so comfortable in Johannesburg and Cape Town. So 1930 then precedes the real rise of what I've called, following Todd Endelman, programmatic anti-Semitism. It's in 1933 in October that we have the first intimations of the extreme radical right. And it all begins in Cape Town with a sort of violent mass meeting with a character called Louis Weichert, who founds the South African Christian National Socialist Association, party, really, movement he calls it. And he is directly out of the European experience, and in fact had spent time in Germany. He had grown up in Germany, although he was born in South Africa, was disillusioned with South African politics at a particular moment when South African politics was in a state of serious flux. There had been a government of unity, as I said, the Labour Party and the National Party, from 1924. This was unraveling in 1933 in October when he speaks. He is truly within the European fascist camp and an admirer of Hitler. He starts the movement, and although it doesn't have a great number of followers, and although it's condemned in the press across all lines, and although people say there won't be a problem with Jews because we've stopped the Jews coming in, the East European Jews, no one at that point appreciated what was going to happen in Nazi Germany in 1930, and that there would be another influx of German Jews, or planned influx of German Jews, who would once again ignite the anti-alien passions. Weichert was really a nobody. And all these radical rightists were nobodies. And they split into various groups and they fought among each other, males in the main, arguing amongst each other, but attracting attention. And what's particularly interesting is how this minority movement of extremists eventually inform the debate about Jews at the highest levels, whether it's a civil service or whether it is the main parties. But they set the agenda despite by-elections, local elections in which they took part. They didn't succeed. So you have this irony that they're not really powerful at the ballot box, and yet they are setting the debate in a very important way and informing policy and action, as we'll see. So it's a movement of the extreme right moving towards the center. And the best example of the extreme right in action was the famous Grey Shirt trial in Port Elizabeth, which was the first trial in a court of law in which the protocols of the Elders of Zion was actually tested by a court and found to be a fabrication. It was the first trial. It beats the Bern trial. In Bern at the same time there was a trial, but there were technical issues that didn't have it resolved. This in August 1934 has the protocol shown to be a fabrication. A fascinating trial, attracted substantial attention, particularly obviously in the Jewish world, but internationally in the Jewish world. And it's a trial in which one saw the nexus of anti-Semitism with people interacting, characters from Canada, letters between them, communicating, Britain, and very shady people moving across the scene, giving evidence, and so forth. It really evolved around one extreme rightist by the name of von Moltke, Johannes Strauss von Moltke, but not related to the famous German family. Von Moltke announces in one of those radical right meetings that he's got this document and we must get to the bottom of it. And they had invented this thing, breaking into a synagogue in Port Elizabeth, and they blamed the rabbi of the synagogue. And according to libel law in South Africa, because an individual had been libeled, they could take it to court. And the Jewish leadership, represented in the Jewish Board of Deputies, wanted to put this matter to rest. There had been murmurings of the protocols in the late 20s, and so it resulted in a very important victory for the Jews. But by then, there was a split in white politics. The PAC government broke up, with D.F. Milan breaking away in the wake of a coalition between the South African Party and the National Party to form the purified National Party. That's the National Party which comes to power in 1948 and sets up the apartheid regime, led by D.F. Milan, the first Prime Minister in 1948. But in 1934 he breaks away in the Cape, and it's from that area that he starts mounting an assault on the center of South African politics. And the Jewish question plays a very important part in the process of mobilizing and in challenging the Smuts, the United Party, which is then under J.B.M. Herzog, the United Party, with Jan Smuts as his deputy. The pressure mounts largely because German Jews start moving into the country. They're not flooding the country by any means, but they're coming in greater numbers than before, and they're arousing the passions of the radical right, and Milan hears the noise and starts using it. Throughout this period, there's an interesting relationship between Milan and the extreme right. Scholars have looked at him. They've seen him as an opportunist, not deeply embedded in anti-Semitic ideas. Well, it's a complex character. But he certainly, on occasion, even if he is an opportunist, now I would share that to a large extent, he certainly buys into conspiratorial thinking about the Jews and starts speaking in terms which are very much in line with the rhetoric and language of the radical right. Essentially, the Jews are unassimilable. They cannot merge. They're another race problem. And people are straight and frank about it. They say we've already got the Africans, and of course they don't use a politically correct term. They use the old race term, Kafirs, they say publicly. We've got the Asians or Indians, and we've got the coloreds, those of mixed descent. And we don't need another race problem. The Jew is racialized by then in a full way. In the meantime, the Jew is upwardly mobile. They're in the cities. They're disproportionately moving into the professions, finance, insurance, and so forth. And this is also affecting the poor white Afrikaner who sees them as competition, has a zero-sum sense of the economy. If they're succeeding, they can't succeed. The cake's not going to get bigger, which we're all going to share. It's at our expense. Also at this time, there's a great amount of propaganda material coming in from German Southwest Africa, which was a mandate after the First World War of South Africa, present-day Namibia. So Southwest Africa becomes a font of information and pamphlets creeping into South Africa, used by the radical right, disseminated by the radical right. And by 1936, there's been a proliferation of radical right movements. There are about 6 all in all, even though they fight with each other, and as I say, they don't perform very well at election time, local elections. They inform the debate in a very important way. In addition to that, impetus is given by the Afrikaner wool farming lobby. They see the supposed boycott of German goods as leading to Germans boycotting their goods. There's no evidence for this, but they raise this from time to time in Parliament and suggest that this is very bad and we've got to stop things and put them right. The pressure is so great that Herzog's government, the United Party government in the mid-30s, decides under pressure to introduce special financial and educational qualifications to enter the country. This is a backdoor way of stopping the German Jewish immigration. By then, about 3,500 had entered. By the way, the South African Jewry at this time is around 4% of the total population of whites. Okay, minuscule in the wider sense, about 70,000. So the new legislation is due to come into operation on the 1st of November 1936. The community organizes and charters a special ship to bring Jews from Bremen, 587, to South Africa on a ship called the Stuttgart. And it makes its way to the Cape, and it arouses on its journey the fact that it's coming a huge amount of protest. And most of the protest is coming from Stellenbosch University and young Afrikaner professors. These were people at the forefront of folkish thinking, among them H.F. Verwoerd, as I said, the architect of apartheid. They are having mass meetings at the university across the Cape, in the cities as well, and using this arrival of the Stuttgart to generate a great amount of tension. The Stuttgart is due to dock at midnight. That evening, the grey shirts have another meeting. That's the Weichart crowd. Sort of drunken frenzy, people march off to the docks to protest. The ship doesn't come in that night. There's a storm. It comes in the next morning. By then, just a handful of people at the quayside with a few swastikas, although people remember it. We've interviewed people who were on that ship, and they said to each other, we've just left Germany, why are we coming here? They saw these swastikas at the quayside. That's quite an embedded dimension of the South African Jewish memory, the Stuttgart affair. Everyone seems to have come on the Stuttgart, which of course is not the case. And yet, the fact that they've introduced these educational and financial arrangements to control immigration makes no difference. And the United Party government agrees to introduce an Aliens Act early in 1937 to stop German Jews. This is done with the approval of Jewish leadership. As long as Jews were not mentioned by name, they felt this would not sully the Jewish image, and they would use notions of unassimilability. That was the catchword, and there would be an immigration selection board with particular criteria, but effectively it stopped German Jewish immigration coming into South Africa. By then, folkish Afrikaner nationalism is rising. This is the great moment which is going to lead to 1948, and it uses the Jews. Jews serve a function in their worldview. On the one hand, they can attack the capitalist with the symbol of Hockenheimer as a particular Jewish image. On the other hand, they're very concerned about the subversive trade unionists, among them present-day Judge Albie Sachs's father, Solly Sachs, chairman of the head of the Garment Workers Union, who's building cross-race alliances. So the Jew is undermining society, eating into it, and the Jew is linked with the red peril and the black danger, what we call in Afrikaans the swart gevaar. And the folkish Afrikaner nationalists are pushing that line. At the helm is Verwoerd. By then he's seconded for the movement to start a northern newspaper, a mouthpiece of the nationalist movement, the Transvaaler, which he introduces on the 1st of October 1937. And his first op-ed on that day, opening of the newspaper, is the Jewish questions in Afrikaans, obviously the Jewish question from an Afrikaner nationalist point of view. And he talks about a clash of interests, a botsing van belange, in which he doesn't hate Jews, and no one hates Jews, but there's a clash of interests between the Jews and the Afrikaners. And he will push this line for the next decade. He wants to have proportional representation in business. Interestingly, these ideas are being brought into South Africa today with very different etiologies, but the idea of representativity, groups of society being represented according to their numbers. So for him, the problem was the Jews are disproportionately involved, and he'll push that line for a long, long time. And we see it in the 1938 general election. The United Party under Herzog is the Jew-United Party. It's the liberal, capitalist, Jewish threat that's operating. Scholars up to now have raised issues of anti-Semitism in the 1930s in a marginal way. People like Dunbar Moody, more importantly, Patrick Furlong, most thoroughly, I would say, up to now. There have been pieces, and they've minimized the 38 election. Looking closely at the hustings over the months in the build-up, the Jewish question played a very important role in it. And in many ways, it was easier to attack the United Party from the right by using the Jew and conflating Jew with United Party, Jew-United Party, than attacking the English speakers as such. And the United Party, although it was a mixture of Afrikaners and English, it had the tinge of a pro-empire party. Well, in this flush of Afrikaner folkish nationalism, you have the celebration of the Great Trek, that seminal commemorative moment in South African history when the Boers went into the interior in 1838. And it's a big moment. It gets used and abused in 1938 to give fire to Afrikaner nationalism as voortrekkers reenact the famous Great Trek. They move through the country. And it's a seminal moment, and it leads soon afterwards to the creation of the Ossewa Brandwacht, the Oxwagon Sentinel, which is a movement of the extreme right, which starts off allegedly as a cultural organization to advance Afrikaner interests and culture, but it's really highly politicized. It's exclusivist, and it soon falls into the hands of a pro-Nazi, van Rensburg, who leads it. He comes out of the United Party stable. He had worked with Herzog, a clever man, von Rensburg, but he becomes the leader of the Ausüber Brandwacht, which becomes a very important factor once war breaks out, but we'll get to that in a moment. So really what Afrikaner nationalism is using the Jew for is to paper over cracks within it, class divisions within the Afrikaner, because there's great fear that Solly Sachs and other trade unionists are breaking up the Volkisch mold. The Afrikaner nationalist project is undermined where there are class alliances between Afrikaners and English and Afrikaners and even blacks. So the Jew then serves a particular function. It helps define the Afrikaner as well, the other helping in who the Afrikaners are. In this moment, within the United Party, there's a fellow by the name of Oswald Pirro. He had studied in Germany as a young man, and he had come back to South Africa as a senior legal mind, entered the government, Afrikaans speaking, but very allied with Germany. And he was a cabinet minister in the United Party. Within the United Party, this is not the extreme right Afrikaners. He goes to Germany, he deals with Germany from the government's point of view. He's intoxicated with the excitement of what's going on in Nazi Germany. He's there for a number of visits. I think he's there at the time of the Olympic Games as well. Later on, his daughter will say in an interview with the London Daily Express that he's more German than South African. But he starts a movement within the United Party, the New Order or Nieuwe Orde, within it, within the caucus. He runs this movement, and it's absolutely pro-Hitler, and the storm clouds are building up. This is 38, 39, we know what happened, and he's looking towards a pro-Nazi position should war break out. And of course, that pro-Nazi position and this empathy for Nazi Germany has deep roots. It goes back to the Anglo-Boer War, it goes back to the anti-British sentiment, which leads to a number of wars against the British, the First War of Independence in the 19th century, later the Anglo-Boer War. So there was a sort of love relationship for Germany among many Afrikaners, but certainly a hostility towards Britain. So to support, to be opposed to war would not necessarily mean one's pro-Hitler, certainly not wanting to fight on the side of the British. Pirro runs this new order within the party, has about 17 members. It's a small minority within it, but when war breaks out, he eventually falls out, and the Nieuwe Order and the Ausüber Brandwacht become absolutely pro-Germany. And of course, their movement follows the ebbs and flows of the fighting, and the South Africans are looking which way they're to go, because they do join in a very divided way to fight on behalf of Britain, join the Commonwealth war effort in 1939. A very divided parliament enters the war after the cabinet supports by one person joining with the British challenge. And this upsets the Afrikaners particularly, and they have a subversive movement within the country during the war. Things calmed down in the sense of the high point of the 38 election, general election, and the passions of 39, 40, 41. Once the war starts turning by the end of 42 and 43, there's another general election in South Africa. And at that point, there's far less discussion about the Jews in that. The extreme right is there. Weigart is interned. Another person interned is B.J. Vorster, becomes a prime minister later. The Smuts, by the way, becomes prime minister when they go to war. Herzog didn't agree, goes into the wilderness. Just in parenthesis, Herzog has a fascinating interview with the British High Commissioner, which I happen to see in a document in which the High Commissioner, these are in the Public Record Office in London, the High Commissioner asks Herzog about the anti-Semitism. And Herzog said, it's not really hatred of the Jew. This is in about 1943. So it's not hatred of the Jew. The Afrikaner in the countryside hates all non-Afrikaners, Scottish, this, and this. And the High Commissioner thinks, well, but what about the urban hatred? It's not just the countryside. Herzog then goes on to buy into the Nazi line and talks about the Jews in Weimar, and takes a completely Nazi view of the Jews causing the defeat of the First World War and setting up Weimar and all the problems that followed. But Herzog's out of the picture. Smuts is absolutely, as you know, in the British war effort. And in 43 things turn, and the Jewish question is far less than in 38. And it begins to subside after that. Louis Weichert, by the way, was also interned. They're all going to make a return, these characters, to the government, to the Senate, after 48. And things start calming down. Now, what about the extreme right within the National Party? There are figures like Eric Lowe would become a future foreign minister. He was an extremist. He's a man who had been a minister plenipotentiary in Washington, in Europe, and a number of others. And by the way, the bureaucracy in the United Party was filled with anti-Semites who were behind drafting of all these laws and fully in favor. Much, by the way, to the chagrin of Jannie Hofmeyr. Hofmeyr, the great liberal hope in South Africa, he had been fighting with the bureaucracy in his various ministerial capacities against this anti-Semitism. And yet even Hofmeyr interestingly spoke about racial stock, and he welcomed Jews and was a philo-Semite in many ways, but Hofmeyr also spoke about we can only have immigration in proportion to the racial composition of the country. And here one needs to think of the South African nation constructing a notion of South Africanness. There was a book written in 1940 or 41 by one Kelpen, who said the title was "There Are No South Africans." There was no sense of unity. There was an Afrikaner, an English and black African majority on the side, no sense. And in the 30s, the English speakers and the Afrikaners were constructing a sense of South Africanness, and the Jew could never be part of that in the 30s. In fact, they're not the original immigrants. The new South Africans would have come as part of either the English stream or the Afrikaans stream from Europe, the Netherlands, and so forth. This is a different racial stock. That's the language people were using. There's an essentialism about this. And it went so far that the National Party was a federal party when it was formed in 34, in which the Transvaal province, under fellow Strydom, who becomes Prime Minister of South Africa in the 50s, they would not allow Jewish membership. Straight out, no Jewish members. It's not clear if the Free State followed. There's some ambiguity, but Milan made it absolutely clear when he was pressurized with the Cape Party to not have Jewish members. He said there's no need for it because Article 1 in our Constitution talks about Christian membership. So we don't have to have it in your face. And yet Strydom would continue after the war with his henchmen on the right to push Milan to make it absolutely clear that no Jewish members would be allowed. And Milan would not accept that. Lowe writes him a very long letter, Eric Lowe, to tell him it's dangerous and you're not going to get any Jewish votes anyway, and don't think you can lift this. It'll make no difference and will upset many people, including many English, who are quite happy to not have Jews as members. And English speakers might vote for the National Party in substantial numbers, so don't think you're going to avoid it. And Milan holds back, and he doesn't accept this. Milan wants to put the Jewish question to bed. And in the 1948 elections, the famous elections in which Smuts is voted out, and the National Party comes to power and ends power in 1990, the Jewish question hardly features. A few people at the hustings raise some of the old bogies, but it's not an issue in the election. It doesn't really count. And most interestingly, Jewish leadership meets with Milan behind the scenes to try and reach a modus vivendi for the way forward. And of course, Milan's now thinking of the white apartheid project. Jews are going to be conclusively white. There were intimations that they weren't quite white at various moments earlier on. They weren't black, I don't mean that, but they were not quite white. They were essentially of a different culture, and it's culture in the sense of inherent, immutable, and so forth. So Milan meets with the Jewish leaders. Things are toned down. And a few years later, he writes an introduction to a book on the Jews by a senior rabbi, Israel Abrams, of the Western Cape, who writes a book on the birth of the Jewish community, and Milan writes the foreword. In addition, he's the first head of state to visit the newly created state of Israel. But most interestingly is the foreword where he praises the Jews for their ability to not assimilate effectively. So the unassimilable Jew becomes the example for the Afrikaner at the tip of Africa against decolonization and so forth, to maintain some sense of identity. It's a fascinating change in Milan, and it's really the end of the Jewish question as such with that 48 election. The anti-Semites are around. As I said, some of them are pressurizing Milan not to change direction, but essentially the Jews are going to be part of the apartheid project from 48. They're going to be brought in. They never quite get in until the 70s. They vote United Party and so forth, but they're obviously part of a colonial settler society, and they imbibe the normative racist ideas in that sort of society. And yet, of course, they're disproportionately on the left in the 50s, in the 60s. The government reminds them from time to time that they're disproportionate, but that's really for the third volume of the trilogy. I think we should open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you. The question is, was there intimidation and violence along the way in the period? There was. But Jews were giving as much as they got. The left, the Communist Party, Jews involved in the Communists would go to the city hall and get involved in regular brawls. There was one very important moment of violence in Paarl in the Western Cape. This is already in 1934. Weichardt had come. They were quite powerful in the Western Cape, the Grey Shirts. Weichardt had come to town, and they'd stopped him using a hall, which was, by the way, quite common. They would stop people hiring a hall from the right because the councils were United Party and had Jewish influence, and Weichardt then decided to have an open-air meeting. On a truck he stood and spoke, and that led to a big riot. And Jews would come from Cape Town to fight, and you talk to the old Jewish left now, they have very strong memories, similar to the London experience of Oswald Mosley and Cable Street, not as big as Cable Street, but that sort of thing.
I grew up in Cape Town a little later than the period you're talking about, the 50s and 60s. And my recollection was that we felt the Jewish leadership seemed to have a relationship with the Nationalist Party that was counter to our belief as kids in how things should be placed. Was that a valid perception?
It certainly was quiescent. At a leadership level, you're 100% right. It was part of that deal with Milan. The representative body in South Africa is the Jewish Board of Deputies. And the Jewish Board of Deputies, it's a very problematic area, as you know. There's a book by Gideon Shimoni called Community and Conscience, which tries to judiciously explore this issue over decades. The Jewish community, its leadership, obviously coming out of what I've been speaking about, and it's a lot worse, the details when one gets into them, obviously couldn't stand at the ramparts and say, you know, this National Party is wrong, it's racist, it's following in the footsteps of Hitler, and we're not accepting it in terms of Judaic values. I mean, that, with hindsight, would have been very, very problematic. However, anyone looking back has a sense of embarrassment that the Jewish community didn't say that. They should have spoken out, as in their self-understanding it would have been against any thing within the Jewish tradition and so forth, and they were too quiescent. The Board of Deputies tried to sidestep the issue, and there were serious debates. People like Arthur Sisman and others, not Helen Sisman, a relative, they had serious debates within the Board of Deputies, and they hid behind the notion that it's the rabbinate that has to uphold the moral question, and that they represented the whole community and couldn't speak on behalf of all Jews because there were different fractions. And that goes back to its founding in 1903 and 4, the Board of Deputies. They had that line. They were not a political body. They represented Jewish interests qua Jews. So it became a hot issue among people, and you'll remember it growing up. It was an issue, and the board had sidestepped. The rabbinate was terribly silent. I mean, there were some rabbis who spoke out, But by and large, the rabbinate, with hindsight, was terribly quiet about what would be the moral issue of the day. And in that sense, they don't come off very well. The Board of Deputies also you can attack and criticize. Certainly, it only spoke out unequivocally by the 80s. And even then, P.W. Botha, the president at the time, had said apartheid is dead. It's spoken against it. So the Jews don't come out. But it's a very complex issue to try and pass moral judgment in history at the best of times. Yeah.
I have a vague sense that at possibly at an earlier period that some Afrikaners see Afrikaner itself as a lost tribe of Israel, for which, of course, actual Jews are a problem. Does this come into the period that you studied, or is it?
In Afrikaner memory, the Afrikaners saw themselves as the children of Israel within their historiography, and their great trek is in Exodus. So their sense of chosenness and mission leading ultimately to the civic religion of republicanism and so forth. So there's that. The Afrikaners saw the Jews as the people of the book. And according to the old historiography in South Africa, the Afrikaners had a very close relationship with the Jews precisely because of this identification. I've argued for decades now, in looking at documents, that the Afrikaners were not in love with the Jews. There were many acts of goodwill and lots of hospitality as the Jewish smos, the itinerant peddler, moved around the country. But very often the Jew was a figure of fun. And in 1902, the Afrikaners joined the English in the Old Cape Colony in legislation which stopped East European Jews coming as well. The Cape Immigration Act of 1902, which was primarily directed against the Indian influx, but had language provisions which affected the Jews. The historiography always said that was an accident, and their evidence was that it was reversed 3 years later, and Yiddish as was accepted as a language for entry. I've argued elsewhere that it was only reversed because of pressure from the shipping companies and Jewish leadership from overseas. And it took 3 years to reverse. But certainly the Afrikaners, and there's literature, as you know, on the chosen people idea.
I remember very distinctly how with each successive leader of the Nationalist Party between D.F. Malan and B.J. Vorster, there was increasing concern in the Jewish community based upon their established reputations as being more anti-Semitic, so going to Australia for work and B.J. Vorster and so forth. And quite paradoxically, each successive heir to the leadership of the Nationalist Party seemed to actually tone down even further. And I was curious to know what we know about the conversation within the Nationalist Party, because it seems as if they took their lead from the conversation with D.F. Malan and that decision to let that go to bed. And the fear of increasing revitalization of the anti-Semitic sentiment was never realized.
I think what happens, and you're absolutely right, I mean, each Prime Minister came in, Stratham coming in with his record in the 30s, outspoken anti-Semite, Vorster interned pro-Nazi activities, P.W. Botha, a rabble-rouser, and some records of anti-Jewish stuff in the 30s. So you're absolutely right. What happens structurally is that the Afrikaner gets the political kingdom in 48 and is immediately in a position to get the economic kingdom over the ensuing decades. And as the Afrikaner rises, so the Jew is no longer seen as an obstacle, and they're not in direct conflict with the Jew. They become more educated, more urbanized, more skilled, and that clash at a structural level of the 30s with the Jew is no longer evident. There is a worry, as I mentioned, about Jews being disproportionately involved in communism, in liberal activities, because they certainly were. And they would remind the Jews from time to time. Even the Israel thing is interesting, because in the early 60s, Israel was moving into Africa and the sort of darling of a great number of countries in Africa, helping with agriculture and so forth. And Israel was voting at the UN against apartheid. And the Jews were asked, you know, what is your loyalty and what's going on with Israel? We thought they're friends of ours. And in the early 60s, Israel is speaking out against apartheid unequivocally. And we want to be sure where you are. And they even stopped money going across to Israel, which would have reversed soon after the Six-Day War started. But there were tense moments, and there was, you know, evidence that Jews were disproportionately involved on the extreme left. Of the 156 people in the treason trial of the mid-50s, 23 were white. Of those 23, 15 were Jewish. That's hugely disproportionate. You know, the fact that they were, in the Jewish sense, on the extreme left and secular and so forth, it made no difference for those observing. They were Jews and people knew it. Remember, the Jews at that point are about 3.7% of the white population, and yeah, they are 15 out of 23. All 5 whites arrested at Rivonia, which leads to the incarceration of Nelson Mandela, were Jewish. So there was a lot of stuff to go on. But at the same time, by the mid-70s, after the Soweto uprising of 76, there was an election, one of those security sort of elections one gets in countries from time to time, set against another country. In this case, it was Andrew Young and Jimmy Carter, who were the center of the election. 1 in 4 Jews voted for the National Party in 77. They had always been the United Party, and then they were disproportionately in the Progressive Party of Helen Suzman. But they were moving to the right through the 70s, and like all whites were shaken up and turned into the lager in the 77 election.
Could you go back to the notion of in some of the anti-Semitic thought, or actually general thought, about Jews not being quite white? I think there's been a lot of work on that.
That's
in other, and actually this is a typical reaction to many immigrant groups that if they came from poor backgrounds, maybe they were not quite white, and you know, depending, they looked more somewhat different. If they're from the Mediterranean,
yes,
or the Irish, and all of that, you know, each generation had its own kind of construction. But could you say a little bit more about it?
The best way to see it is through the iconography. And already in about 1910, you know, you had various minority groups like Indians they'd attacked. Then you'd have a cartoon of a Jew, and you next. They were never quite in the white population. Physically, of course, in everything I'm saying, by the way, Jews had important positions in society. Throughout all of this, and in the 1910s and 20s, you often had the mayor of a small town being Jewish, of large cities being Jewish. You had clubs with a bit of social snobbery. It wasn't, you know, Nazi Germany. But the best example I can think of, Aaron, is in the mid-20s. They were going to introduce the Class Areas Bill, which was a forerunner of the Group Areas legislation which accompanied the Milan government. And at that point, there was great panic among certain Jews because of the language of unassimilability, the essentializing of this culture with race, that Jews were going to be victims of this law. Not primary victims, but they would be there. We better watch out. And Smuts said, no, nonsense, there's no such thought. And it's true, there was no such thought in the mid-20s. But that's how deep the idea of otherness had progressed.
Thank you very much.